Good afternoon, and welcome to another one of our classes on comparative religions. The past several classes we've been looking at the aspects of Islam, how it was first started by a man by the name of Muhammad in what we now would know as the Saudi Arabia area of the world. Muhammad was from the cities of Mecca and Medina, and it was in these areas that he had these visions, these dreams of God speaking to him and recording his dreams and visions into a book that becomes known as the Qur'an, becomes the basis of the tradition of Islam. Following all of his teachings and the teachings of other leaders that came after he died, we have the shaping of contemporary Islam. Now, shortly after Muhammad's death, there was a split in the Islamic community between the Sunni Muslims who were following all of the teachings of Muhammad and saw him as the person that they really had to look up to. And then we had a group known as the Shia, or the Shiite, that split off over the leadership of the Islamic community after the death of Muhammad. There were two different understandings about what this leadership was supposed to be, and the Shiites were following a man by the name of Ali. Shiite means the party of Ali. And we have this division that takes place. And these two major factions of Islam have carried on in the world ever since. They've kept up their traditions, their beliefs and followings, and it's been a part of the growth of Islam throughout the world. Last time around, we took a look at the traditions known as the Nation of Islam, a very particularly American expression of Islamic faith that deviates from mainstream Islam in the following teachings of various people. Fard Muhammad was one, Elijah Muhammad was another, a man by the name of Malcolm X, and another man who we've become very common known in our world today, Louis Farrakhan. The leaders of this Nation of Islam have been distinctly an African American tradition and their beliefs. We were examining them last week. Well, today we're going to come to our last in this series of classes on Islam, and we're going to be looking at a movement that is known as Wahhabi, or Wahhabism. And we'll see how that develops over the course of time in the Middle East and comes into play and having an impact and an effect in our world today. So let's get on with that, and we'll get on to our slides. And we'll be looking here at the Wahhabi traditions of Islam. This is a religious movement. It was a reform movement in Sunni traditions that has variously been described as orthodox, meaning proper beliefs, ultra-conservative, austere, fundamentalist, and puritanical. It was a reform movement that began to try and get the Sunni Islamic tradition back to its origins. It was going to restore, according to their beliefs, a pure monotheistic worship. Monotheism, the worship of one God, and of course, in the Islamic tradition, that one God is Allah, the one God. And this movement of reform wants to get back to the pure worship of Allah. Adherents often object to this term Wahhabi, or Wahhabism, as derogatory, particularly in our modern world, and they prefer to be called Salafi. We can use these terms interchangeably, but we'll see why the name Wahhabi or Wahhabism is the one that is used most often. The majority of people who hold to this tradition, the Wahhabi tradition, come from Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and of course, Saudi Arabia. This is where the tradition has its most powerful influence, but we'll see how this has begun to spread out into other parts of the world in recent years. Now, the whole tradition was founded by a man by the name of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Basically, they believe that he was born sometime around 1703. He lived to be 1791, so he had a very good long life. And he lived in what is now it's the Sinai Peninsula, Saudi Peninsula, and it was there that he was living in his time period in what we now know as modern-day Saudi Arabia. Now, he was a religious scholar, and what he began to teach was that any addition to Islam after the year 950 in the Common Era were wrong. They were texts that really had no relationship to true Islam, and they had to be just completely done away with. Anything after 950 is a modern invasion into the traditional faith of Muhammad the Prophet. And what he was calling for was a purification of the Sunni sect of Islam. He regarded things that were going on in Sunni tradition, but also very apparently in the Shia tradition, the veneration of saints, ostentation in worship, and any kind of luxurious living. All of these things were considered to be evil. He wanted to get back to the basics of Muhammad the Prophet, who lived a very simple, austere life and didn't go in for any kind of worldliness. It was a tradition that was based on caring for the most vulnerable people in society. Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab wants to get back to those early traditions of the faith. Shia expressions of veneration for, and the prominent narratives that they have in the Shia tradition about Ali, about Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, and about the 12 Imams were really, really criticized by Wahhab. The Shia invoked these people as the models of the faith and encouraged people to follow in their traditions. They recognized that some of these leaders, like Muhammad, like Ali, like Fatima, like the Imams, had this possession of a real strong moral quality to their lives. They were good people. And we would read and understand and study and try to live up to the values and qualities and moral values that they had. These were the things that became important. And in the Shiite tradition, women took Fatima as the ideal. Little girls would want to grow up to be just like her, the daughter of Muhammad the Prophet. Pure, innocent. Men would want to have people like Ali and Hussein as their ideals, and they would emulate them, and they would venerate them as heroes of the faith. Shrines were built to their honor, and people would go on pilgrimages to these shrines so that they could worship and adore these prominent figures in the Islamic tradition. Now, these practices of the Shia would have been considered heresy. They were just completely wrong. You just can't do that kind of thing. You can't have these heroes of the faith. You can't have adoration. You can't have shrines built to people. It's wrong. And so they set about the process of trying to take that all apart. Muslims, according to the Wahhabi tradition, Muslims who practice such innovations are not just misguided. They're not just doing something wrong. According to the Wahhabi tradition, they were outside the pale of Islam altogether. In other words, they were not Muslims. They were not a part of the Islamic tradition. They were outside. Now, what happened here through his life is Wahhab began to gain control over various aspects of life. Education was a big part. The Institute of Law became riddled with Wahhabi traditions and beliefs. Public morality and religious institutions all came under his sway, and he was able to exercise great deal of power and authority in the area which we now call modern-day Saudi Arabia. His religious reforms included the demolition of the tomb of Zayd ibn al-Khattab. He was one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the other things that was very clear in this tradition of Wahhabism in this time period was the fact that women particularly were to be very pure, they were to be very holy and pious, and, well, adulterous women were subject to being stoned to death. It was a part of the reforms that were going on over education law, public morality, and the religious institutions. We get rid of these tombs, we get rid of these shrines, we take all of this stuff and we enforce the laws of behavior very strongly. Now, what Wahhab emphasized was the unity of God. His focus on absolute monotheism led to him and his followers being referred to as muwahhidin, or Unitarians. There is one God, and that God's name is Allah. There can't be any other confusion here. There can't be any other God admitted into this world. We simply are going to emphasize the unity of this one God, Allah. In order to be true Muslims, according to this belief system, you have to adhere solely and strictly to the original beliefs that are set forth by Muhammad in the Qur'an. And therefore, the Qur'an becomes the only and the most important book in the tradition of Wahhabism. Now, 1700s in Western Europe, and even now beginning to spread in through the Americas, the ideas of the Enlightenment are becoming quite common. They are beginning to spread and influence and impact aspects of life, even in the Arab world. The Wahhabi tradition was against all forms of modernity. They were against secularism, and they completely were opposed to any of the ideas of enlightenment. The understanding that man has a mind and a reason, can work things out for himself, this understanding of a God who is not involved in the world, all of these parts of the Enlightenment are rejected out of hand by Wahhab and his followers. Anti-secularism, anti-modernism became very extreme. And the extremism of the Wahhabi tradition led to, quite often, a series of aspects of violence and warfare. Jahiliyyah refers to, in this tradition, the barbarism and state of ignorance which existed prior to the coming of Islam and would be incorporated in any kind of modernist, secular understandings of the world. It's barbarism, it's ignorance, and it has to be rejected completely out of hand. We want nothing to do with it at all. Anything that exists after the year 950 in the Common Era has to be rejected. Now, according to this tradition, only those who follow these strict teachings are truly Muslim, because they're the only ones who follow the straight path. If you are not a follower of Wahhab and this new type of education, this new legal system, this new understanding of society, then you're not truly a Muslim and you don't belong with us. Now, here was the problem. In the Quran, it is very clear that one Muslim is not allowed to kill another. And yet, what happens here is if you can say that this other person is not a true Muslim, you then can kill them. Murder, warfare, terrorism becomes a legitimate expression of the faith. If you're not a Muslim, we can attack you. Very clearly, very simply, and it begins to turn the community against itself. Now, Wahhab was driven out of Medina for his preaching, and his strictness and his austerity and the fundamental nature, the fundamentalist nature of his teachings were not exactly widely accepted at this time, and he had to move into the Riyadh region And while he was there, he had the opportunity to continue to preach and was able to convert the Saud tribe in the southern part of the peninsula. The Saudi sheikh, Muhammad ibn Saud, was convinced that it was his religious mission to wage holy war, jihad, against all other forms of Islam. And he began the conquest of his neighbors somewhere around the year 1763. This becomes a religious war. It becomes the followers of Wahhab, led by Muhammad ibn Saud, who begins to fight against the other Islamic traditions of Sunnism and Shiaism. These are the things that are going on, and this holy war is beginning to spread. By the year 1811, the Wahhabis ruled the entire Arabian Peninsula except for Yemen, and they established the capital as Riyadh. Their most noteworthy and controversial attack was on the town of Karbala, which was a very holy city. They attacked the city and destroyed it, and it was very controversial in the fact of doing that because this was an important area in the life of the Islamic traditions. But they felt that these inhabitants of Karbala were not Muslims, and therefore they could be killed and war could be waged against them. They killed the majority of the people in the town. And in the town of Karbala, which was a pilgrimage site, there was a tomb there to al-Hussein, and they destroyed the place. And they attacked the people, killed the people, and it was an aspect of basically what was happening was Muslims turning against Muslims in an act of war, holy war, in order to win out your own style of beliefs and traditions. The Wahhabi were willing to carry this out. Now, as the Ottoman Empire begins to really influence this area at this time, the ruler, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, begins to set out to try and crush this Wahhabi tradition. But only when the Sultan called on a man by the name of Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but another one, a man by the name of Muhammad Ali from Egypt, for assistance, did he actually meet success in driving the Wahhabi out of the area and out of power. By 1818, the Wahhabis were all driven out into the desert, and they had lost all of their power, all of their political influence, but they still held on to a tremendous amount of religious influence in the Islamic world. They slowly built their power up again, and between the years of 1821 and 1833, they gained control over the entire Persian Gulf coast of Arabia. They were coming back. And then they were able to enjoy a major triumph when the fifth generation of Ibn Saud came out of captivity in Riyadh in 1902. There was a reconstitution in 1933 of nearly all of the old ancestral domain of the original Ibn Saud, and now it has all come together as a new nation in 1932 under the name of Saudi Arabia, the country that we are most familiar with nowadays. And the Wahhabis have been able to have this major triumph, and now they have not just religious authority, but they have political power to go along with it. The Saudi family is very, very much deeply connected to the Wahhabi traditions. Under the reign of al-Aziz, he was the fifth generation Ibn Saud, they gained control over all religious institutions, and they had jurisdiction over a considerable territory of the country. They have increased their power exponentially. In later years, the Wahhabi ideas formed the basis for all of the rules and laws in the kingdom. the Saudi kingdom. Social affairs, judicial, educational policies, all of this came under the influence of this Wahhabi tradition and all of their very strict interpretations and the very ultra-conservative understandings of their faith. This now becomes the norm in Saudi Arabia. There was a strong aversion in the areas that were controlled by the Wahhabi of mixing with idolaters. By idolaters, they mean two things. Number one, if you were a Sunni Muslim who did not accept the teachings of Wahhab and did not fit into this Wahhabism, you were an idolater. If you were a Shiite, well, you were an idolater. And what do we do with idolaters? They're not Muslims, we can kill them. And they were certainly concerned about contact with Westerners, particularly the British. In the period of time after World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Wahhabi influence became much more prominent. The nation becomes established as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Britain certainly is involved in there very deeply after the end of World War I, and there's a deep concern about being in contact with any Westerners. Voluntary contact was considered by the Wahhabi clerics to be at least a sin. If you were a member of the Wahhabi tradition and you had a contact with any British or Westerners whatsoever, wow, you're in for some punishment as a result. If you enjoyed the company of idolaters and you approved of their religion, this was seen as an act of unbelief, and it could be your acceptance of the Shiite traditions, it could be your acceptance of the traditions of Christianity or Judaism, any kind of way of approving of a religion of an idolater is considered an act of unbelief, and you will suffer the consequences for it. Traveling outside this area, which was known as the Najd, outside of the land of Saudi Arabia, was tightly controlled, if not prohibited altogether. They didn't want anybody going out and interacting with the larger world. The larger world is a place of secularism. It's a place of immorality. We don't want anybody to be influenced by that. And so travel is prohibited. Now what happens here is a change that begins to take place. A major current in regional politics was secular nationalism, which was promoted by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. He is beginning to embrace and accept secular nationalism as an appropriate way of living and governing. What happens was the Wahhabi begin sending missionaries into Egypt, and they worked very closely with Saudi foreign policy to try and overcome this movement towards secular nationalism. It's a danger. We can't have it. Missionaries were sent to Africa, where they would be able to build schools and fund those schools, to distribute religious literature, and they did this in Nigeria, Chad, Niger, the Cameroon, other places across the northern part of Africa, to try and present their teachings as the only way to live. The only acceptable way of being a Muslim was to be in the fold of the Wahhabi traditions, and very much opposed to any growth or any proposition that's going to allow for secular nationalism, secularism, and idolatry to take place. So their influence is beginning to spread out further and further in this time period. In the 1950s and 1960s, within Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi maintained their hold on religious courts. They presided over the creation of Islamic universities. The public school system was run by the Wahhabis, which meant every child in school was exposed to very deeply the religious institutions of the Wahhabi faith. It is a part of the educational system from the youngest ages all the way up through universities, and they have a very strong hold over the religious law courts at the same time. So their power is pretty serious, and the control that they have over the population in Saudi Arabia is almost complete. And then things begin to change a little bit more because oil is discovered. And Western countries like Great Britain, the United States, France, Germany, other countries begin coming into this area in the time period during World War II and afterwards, and begin the export of oil from Saudi Arabia. And what happens is the money that is made by the Saudi government is able to be turned over to the Wahhabi traditions and activities, and religious activities are funded in the 1950s and 1960s to a very strong extent. 1973 oil crisis. Do you remember the oil crisis in 1973? OPEC became a household word, and the cost of oil went up. Quadrupling the price of oil gave the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a tremendous amount of money. And it gave them a position of political power because they became the leader of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. They have all of a sudden wealth and political power on a worldwide scale. And behind all of it is the Wahhabi tradition and the beliefs and the very ultra-conservative understanding of social living. Tens of billions of dollars in this time period of the 1970s were spent on education. From primary school to postgraduate schools, books, media schools, scholarships, fellowships, everything went to people who could promote and teach the Wahhabi traditions. Journalists were rewarded because they wrote favorable things about the tradition. Academics and scholars were supported because they were teaching the essentials of the Wahhabi tradition and beliefs. And they earn the preeminent position of strength in the global expression of Islam from the 1970s forward. They suddenly have a powerful influence through the Saudi government in world affairs. And they are able to continue to expand in their educational efforts, not only in Saudi Arabia, not only in Africa, but in other places as well. And then December 1979 comes along, and this becomes another major turning point in the history of this tradition. Conservative, fundamentalist Islamic tradition is growing in many places based on the expanse of Wahhabism out of Saudi Arabia in the 70s and into the early 1980s. But December 79 is a marked period because here the Soviet Union is so upset over the growing Islamic insurgency that is basically fueled by the Wahhabi teachings. They are very much opposed to a modernization of the Afghanistan government, this understanding of Western world and Soviet world influence into an Arab or Islamic nation. Well, the Soviet Union is so deeply concerned over this growth that they invade Afghanistan to try and prop up their puppet government in Afghanistan. Shortly thereafter, right after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a man by the name of Abdullah Yusuf Azam, he was a part of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was a cleric. He had very deep ties to Saudi Arabia and to their religious institutions. He issued what is known as a fatwa declaring a defensive jihad against Afghanistan. A fatwa is a law that is passed, an order that is passed that says you have to follow this. And what he was calling for was jihad against the Soviet Union because of the invasion of Afghanistan, and declared that this was a way of defending Islam. And that's where things begin to get heated in this region of the country. This edict, this fatwa, was supported by Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti, the highest religious scholar in the nation. And his name was al-Aziz ibn Baz. He was the Grand Mufti. This is a huge position in the Islamic tradition. And he agrees with this edict and calls on Muslim men to fight. Between 1982 and 1992, there is estimated that 35,000 individual Muslims volunteered to go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets and to fight the Afghan regime. We have all of these people coming out of Saudi Arabia, 35,000 of them, going up into Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets and to fight against the government that the Soviets are trying to prop up. Somewhere between 12 and 25,000 of those volunteers came directly out of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the other conservative Gulf monarchies also provided considerable financial support to the jihad. It is estimated that by 1982, they were providing $600 million a year to the Afghan rebels fighting against the Soviets so that they could buy weapons, they could buy supplies, everything they needed to carry out and fight the war against Saudi Arabia. By 1989, Soviet troops had given up, and they withdrew from Afghanistan. And within a few years, not only did the pro-Soviet government in Kabul collapse, but the Soviet Union itself had collapsed. And Afghanistan fell into chaos. And what happened was many of these jihad volunteers returned back home to Saudi Arabia. But in the process, they often had become very radicalized Islamic militants. They were very deeply connected to the Wahhabi tradition and very deeply under the opinion that anything that was not a part of their background, their tradition, their beliefs was immoral, illegal, and needed to be destroyed, and jihad was the answer. And one person in particular, Osama bin Laden, was one of these warriors that had volunteered to fight in Afghanistan. He comes back into Saudi Arabia deeply radicalized by what had happened over the fighting with the Soviet Union. Now, for more than 2 centuries, Wahhabism has been seen as Saudi Arabia's dominant faith. They're more powerful than any other group within the country. It's such an austere form of Islam that it insists on an absolute literal interpretation of the Qur'an. Strict Wahhabis believe that all those who don't practice their form of Islam are heathens and enemies. And so, the Shiite are heathens. Sunnis that will not follow the Wahhabi traditions are heathens. Anybody of any other religion in the world, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, the Yazidis of Iraq, the Druze of Israel and Syria and the Golan Heights, they're heathens and they're enemies. Anyone who comes from a Western tradition, anyone who comes from a Christian tradition, are heathens and enemies, and the only thing that you can do is carry out jihad against them. The religious curriculum in Saudi Arabia teaches people there are basically 2 sides to this world. The Salafis, or the Wahhabis, are the winners. They are the chosen ones, and they are the ones that will go to heaven. That's it. You have to be a part of this tradition. The rest are Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and others, and they are all going to be destroyed. They are either kafirs, who are deniers of God, or mushrak, who put gods next to God, or what they call innovators. The innovators of religion are the ones that they call Sunni Muslims, who celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday and do some things that are not accepted by Salafis. All of these people are supposed to be hated, they are supposed to be persecuted, and they are even supposed to be killed. Anybody who does not fit into the Wahhabi tradition has given up their right to life. They have to be hated, they have to be persecuted, they have to be killed. There are several clergy, and not just one clergy, that have said this against the Shia and against other Muslims. If you are not with us, you are the enemy, and we have to hate you, we have to persecute you, and we have to kill you. Jihad is the only answer. Wahhabi religious leaders reject any reinterpretation of the Qur'an when it comes to issues settled by the earliest Muslims. The absolute literal interpretation of the text of the Qur'an is the only thing that matters. We can't add to it, we can't take away from it. Any attempt at reinterpretation of this is wrong. Wahhabists opposed the 19th and 20th century Muslim reform movements, which reinterpreted aspects of Islamic law in order to bring it closer to Western civilization standards. They rejected that. We can't have any influence from the outside world, particularly not any influence from Judaism or Christianity. We have to be completely in among ourselves with the absolute literal interpretation of the Quran. Everything else is wrong. So there are some practices that are forbidden by the Saudi Arabian Wahhabi tradition. Performing or listening to any kind of music. Dancing, fortune-telling, any religious programming unless it's religious, any television programs unless it is religious. Smoking, playing backgammon, playing chess, immoral. Drawing any kind of human or animal figure, immoral. Acting in a play or writing fiction, completely rejected. Recorded music played over the telephones. Have you ever gotten on your telephone to talk to like the electric company or the phone company and you get put on hold and playing that music? That's evil. It's completely forbidden. Sending flowers to friends or relatives who are in the hospital. Cannot do this. Listening to any music that seeks to praise Muhammad. Can't do it. If you're going to visit a tomb of somebody who has died, a family member, you are not permitted to pray while you are there. You cannot celebrate the birthday of the Prophet. You can't use any kind of ornamentation in or on mosques. And women are not permitted to drive motor vehicles. This is very, very strictly enforced in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is strictly enforced in other places where the Wahhabi tradition holds sway. Very austere, very conservative, ultra-conservative, very rigid in its understanding of how you are to live your life. Now, here's the thing. According to this tradition, this is not simply one school of thought out of many. Rather, it is the only path of true Islam. Nothing else counts. If it is not a part of the Wahhabi teaching, it does not belong anywhere in the understanding of true Islam. It is the only path. There are not many different ways to get there. They are the only ones who have the right truth. And what has happened here is Wahhabism has had the opportunity to spread. It's been influential throughout other extremist movements throughout the Middle East. Obviously, Osama bin Laden was deeply influenced by these beliefs, and when he went back up into Afghanistan after being pretty much pushed out of Saudi Arabia, went back up into Afghanistan, it was there that he became very deeply connected with the Taliban and their attempt to control all of life under Wahhabi traditions in the nation of Afghanistan, which of course led to, well, the destruction of the towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and an airplane crash in western Pennsylvania on September 11th, 2001, and the United States' involvement in the war in Afghanistan since that time. ISIS, the Islamic State, is the outgrowth of this Wahhabism. It has its efforts in Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran. They have tried to influence that entire region of the world. They are strictly Wahhabists. The Muslim Brotherhood, very powerful in Egypt, very powerful in Saudi Arabia and in other places in the world. The Muslim Brotherhood has at times been accepted, at other times it has been considered to be a terrorist organization. It is a very difficult situation. In Egypt, for a very short period of time, the leader of Egypt was connected with the Brotherhood and yet was removed from power. A lot of fighting going on there. Boko Haram, which is very active in Nigeria and in other places in Africa, and the organization known as Jamaat-i-Islami is another terrorist organization. All of these, from Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, ISIS, they all are basically deeply connected to Wahhabism. They see this as the only acceptable belief system in the world. They are right and everybody else is wrong. And the only way that they can win is by carrying out jihad against anything that stands in their way. We have seen the effects of Wahhabism in our world in the recent years, from the 1970s on right up to our very common, very present time. And we've seen a lot of the warfare and violence, terrorism that has been carried out as a part of this tradition. And yet they continue to hold most of the power, most of the positions of influence in the religious and political life of Saudi Arabia and of other nations in the world. It's a tradition that we are going to continue to be dealing with in the future going forward, because it is not going away. So we're going to finish there for today. I hope that you have enjoyed this one. This is the end of our classes on Islam. In the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be taking a little bit of vacation. Daniel may be putting up some previously recorded shows for you to watch, but when I come back from my vacation, we will be starting in with a new set of religious traditions that all come under a category of what is known as syncretism. Syncretism, just to make it short and brief, is when you take a little bit of this idea and a little bit of that idea, maybe a little bit of this idea and a little bit of that idea, and you bring them all together to create something new. We're going to be looking at some religious traditions in our world, both ancient ones as well as modern ones, that have acted out in this syncretistic way of bringing all of these different elements together to create new faiths. And we'll be picking up with that again in just a couple of weeks. Hope you're able to join me then. Have a wonderful afternoon.